Hello, I'm Jack Perkins. Welcome to Biography. For the past several years, we Americans have been celebrating the birthdays of Washington and Lincoln on the same day. Is that fair that they should have to share a holiday? Don't great men and great women of history deserve better? Well, we hope to rectify the situation a bit by giving one of them, if not his own day, at least his own hour. Aside from the cherry tree legend, which of course isn't true, most of us don't know much about George Washington, the man. Over the years, we've made him into an awe-inspiring idol, cold, remote, lifeless, a withering stare peering at us from a dollar bill. Well, in this hour, we'll take a look at the flesh and blood man behind that graven image. Join us now as Biography presents the life of George Washington.
The poet Robert Frost once remarked that George Washington was one of the few men in all of human history who was not carried away by power. Washington probably could have become king of America if he'd wanted to. There were those who thought he did. Instead, America's first general became the United States' first two-term civilian president, something a world familiar only with hereditary monarchs had never seen. Napoleon, as he lay dying on St. Helena, condemned for having seized the power of an emperor, complained that his critics wanted me to be another Washington. Beneath the marble veneer of the figurehead, the man who has become namesake to thousands of young men, small towns, high schools, a nation's capital, and the 42nd state, whose image is reproduced endlessly on coins, currency, and stamps, whose portrait now hangs in nearly every museum and public building, in whose honor a towering white obelisk was raised on the Capitol Mall, and a huge bust carved into a South Dakota mountain, we find a man seeking to belong, longing for acceptance and respect, hiding his insecurities behind a mask of aloofness, struggling with a sense of his own inadequacies. Rejected as a British officer at age 24, by age 42, the once loyal British subject had become Britain's arch-enemy. Washington risked everything to lead his nation's against-all-odds struggle for independence. Had he failed, he would have been hung as a traitor. In triumph, however, this dignified and self-possessed 6'2" son of Virginia became a great man, perhaps the greatest man of his age, a man we still call the father of a country. George Washington's Virginia was a world in which wealth, power, and family connections defined one's status. He inherited none of these. And yet through hard work, self-cultivation, a fortunate marriage, and a lifetime of public service, he lifted himself from the lesser rungs of Virginia society to its summit. Mason Locke Weems, an Episcopal clergyman and sometime bookseller, is the source of some of those often pious stories about George Washington, like chopping down his father's cherry tree and tossing coins across swollen rivers.
None of those are true. The cherry tree myth started in a biography that appeared after Washington's death by Parson Mason Weems, and very little is known about Washington's childhood, so he simply made up stories that illustrated the qualities that Washington exhibited as an adult, such as honesty. There's a very good source for the silver dollar myth. George Washington raised his wife's 2 grandchildren and 2 children, and the grandson, near the end of his life, wrote his memoirs in which he said that George Washington could throw a piece of slate the size and shape of a dollar across the river. The river he was referring to is the Rappahannock River, which near the site of the Washington homestead was about 250 feet across. The Potomac here at Mount Vernon is 1.25 miles, so that would have been some toss. But those are the 3 big myths, and it's interesting to talk about, but we'd like people to look beyond those myths and see the real George Washington.
The real George Washington was born in a modest farmhouse in Westmoreland County, Virginia, on February 22, 1732, the first child of a middle-aged father's second wife. At mid-18th century, Virginia was a province of the British Empire. Its sparse population of mostly English descent saw themselves as Englishmen, subjects of the king. But the British saw Virginians as crude colonists, second class in every way. Within Virginia itself, at the peak of power were the families of the wealthy planters and others of much lesser wealth and property, which included George Washington. Washington spent his early years on small farms along the Potomac and Rappahannock rivers, in sight of, but never totally within the embrace of, Virginia's well-born, well-heeled elite. His father, Augustine, died when he was 11. George inherited a farmhouse left in trust to his mother, Mary. But the bulk of Augustine Washington's estate, including the sizable plantation at Mount Vernon, went to his older half-brother, Lawrence. Unlike Lawrence, who had been educated in England, George's formal education ended when he was 14. To George, Lawrence represented everything he hoped to be: cultivated, sophisticated, and rich. Lawrence became George's surrogate father, offering guidance and contact with the prominent Fairfax family into which Lawrence had married. The rough adolescent learned his social graces by quietly watching and imitating those in Lawrence's charmed circle. Acutely aware of his own lack of sophistication, fearful of social missteps, he developed lifelong habits of social reserve. He studied books on manners. He read English magazines and translations of Roman classics so that he would have something to say at dinner parties. But to become one of the elite, he needed to make money. By 17, he was working as a frontier surveyor in the Blue Ridge Mountains. At 18, he bought his first piece of land.
Washington, like all Virginians, needed land. Land was the most valuable commodity in an agrarian society. They needed land to replenish their tobacco fields, which wore out in 4 to 8 years. They needed land for speculative purposes, for a rainy day. It was the one form of inheritance they could pass on that would be of great value to their offspring.
During a trip to Barbados with Lawrence when he was 19, George contracted smallpox. It would scar his face for life, but it would also save him by immunizing him to the disease which would ravage his ragged American troops 25 years later. By the time Washington was 20, his carefully cultivated connection with the Fairfaxes led to an appointment as an officer of the Virginia militia. As a new and inexperienced officer, it would not be long before Washington found himself embroiled in his first military campaign. A smoldering Cold War between England and France, fueled by conflicting land claims on two continents, hit a flashpoint in the Ohio Valley, just over the mountains from Virginia. In Europe, the conflict was called the 7 Years' War. In North America, it was known as the French and Indian Wars. As a 20-year-old major of the Virginia militia, Washington's job was to train civilians for war. Unfortunately, he had neither the skills nor the knowledge he was expected to teach. But in typical 18th century fashion, he made up for his lack of practical experience by learning from books. The rest he was expected to make up as he went along. In the fall of 1753, England sent Washington, accompanied by 2 translators and 4 backwoodsmen, to warn the French off its territory. In his first mission as a British colonial officer, Washington managed to embarrass himself in an attempt at French-Indian negotiations, almost froze to death crossing an icy river, and was nearly murdered by his Indian guide. On his second foray into the field, ignoring the fact that England and France were not at war, Washington staged what he described as an Indian attack on a small French camp. Of the 10 killed, 1 was the French diplomatic envoy. The French court branded him an assassin. Those Indian tribes still allied with the English, having witnessed the ineptitude of Washington's militia in action, promptly went over to the French. It was an inauspicious beginning.
Washington's attack on the French in western Pennsylvania, the battle in which he is alleged to have assassinated his opponent, was one of those early episodes where he walked onto the pages of history. Actually, he was criticized by the French, but in fact, people in Virginia defended him, people in England defended him. And indeed, the French commander himself had the authority to use force if necessary if the English or the Virginia militiamen confronted him. So Washington's probably taken something of a bad rap here.
The first real battle between the British and French was engaged at Fort Necessity near present-day Pittsburgh. Though eventually surrounded, and despite losing nearly one-third of his men, Washington fought on and refused to surrender. The French commander, who was the brother of the dead envoy, finally called a ceasefire and allowed Washington's troops to go home. Washington signed a document legitimizing the French attack as revenge for the death of its envoy. Despite his less than stellar performance, Washington received no criticism from his superiors for his actions. Later, at a battle at Fort Duquesne, he demonstrated that what he lacked in strategic ability he more than made up for in sheer bravery when he had 2 horses shot from under him. 3 years later, again at Fort Duquesne, 2 groups of Virginia militiamen stumbled upon one another in the wilderness and mistakenly opened fire on each other. Washington rode between opposing lines, knocking away guns on both sides with his sword. 14 were killed, 26 were wounded. Washington wasn't touched. At age 24, he returned to the Tidewater, a hero to his fellow Virginians. But when he sought a commission as a full British officer, not just as a colonial officer, he was rudely rejected.
The young Washington, commanding a 350-mile line on the Virginia frontier with his so-called Virginia Regiment, thought of himself as anything but a partisan or a guerrilla. He wanted to build a regiment that was modeled after the British kind of unit. He insisted that his men be uniformed, that his officers read British drill manuals, and they received some wonderful compliments from British officers in the Forbes campaign who served with Washington's regiment. So he thought of himself as anything but a frontier soldier. He wanted to be a British officer, and he wanted a British commission, but he never got one.
He resigned from the militia in protest, denied advancement in the British Army. He realized that if he was to make his mark in the world, he would have to do it as a civilian. George's brother Lawrence had died in 1752. A few years later, George became the owner of Mount Vernon, which, though substantial, was nothing at all like the grand plantation it would eventually become. The house was a simple story and a half. There were few slaves and indentured workers to run the farm. Washington had lots of land but little money to work it with, and he was alone. For 10 years, he had wooed a succession of young women, all of whom had rejected him, some because he wasn't rich enough, and some because they were put off by his diffident personality. He had, however, fallen in love with the wife of George William Fairfax, his Mount Vernon neighbor, his mentor, and one of Washington's few close friends. George had met Sally Fairfax when he was 16 and she 18. Sally was dark, witty, and cuttingly charming, a belle of the Tidewater, able to quote great philosophers and discuss the classics with governors and statesmen over punch. Sally had taken it upon herself to groom the rough 16-year-old in the social graces, and he had fallen madly in love. He sent her love letters. She replied carefully, unwilling to risk her standing by becoming involved. Anything more than friendship with Sally was impossible.
Well, I know Sally Fairfax always comes into the act when George Washington is mentioned, and I think there's no doubt that he had a great affection for her. The whole context of the Fairfax family, the patrons of himself, helped in Washington's advancement, and his own childhood had been not as elegant. After all, the Washingtons were, shall we say, second-tier Tidewater aristocracy, where the Fairfaxes were first-tier aristocracy. And Washington, as a young man, was so impressed, and Sally was bright. She was well-educated, well-read. She was a gardener. They loved to talk about gardening. He mentions that in one of his letters. But it must be said that the Fairfaxes and the Washingtons were close friends. And during the time that they were together on adjoining estates, there was much visiting back and forth.
Still pining for Sally, George was introduced to Martha Custis, a 27-year-old widow and mother of 2. Martha Dandridge Custis was 5 foot tall, with a pleasant appearance, was slightly plump, shy, and serious, universally liked and easy to talk to. She was also one of the wealthiest marriageable women in all of Virginia. Her husband, Daniel Custis, had left her 17,000 acres of tobacco, hundreds of slaves, and several farms. While Martha managed the estate herself, she also understood the advantage of having an energetic partner. And while there were many things George Washington was not, he was energetic. The two had only spent 20-some hours together before George proposed marriage. Within the year, they were married, having spent only 15 days in one another's company. In marrying Martha Custis, Washington finally entered the world of the Virginia elite.
She was extremely supportive of him. She complimented him in many ways. She socialized more easily than Washington did, liked to talk with friends and greet them, whereas I think Washington was a little bit shy. And his size was intimidating. He used to frighten the children. But we're told that Mrs. Washington grabbed him by his lapels and pulled him right down to her face when she wanted to talk to him.
As tobacco prices fell and they saw their debts mounting, George and Martha faced a dilemma. Washington was fearful of going into debt, but equally fearful of what others might think if he were unable to maintain his style of life. If he economized, he said, such an alteration in the system of my living will create suspicions of a decay in my fortune, and such a thought the world must not harbor. Image was all important. Washington saw his and his fellow planters' problem as one of dependence on their English agents, the men who sold Virginia's tobacco in Europe and who purchased finished goods on their behalf in London. Washington decided to stop growing labor-intensive, soil-depleting tobacco and grow grains instead. He was soon selling his produce in Alexandria and buying finished goods from local